This week, the steamroller advance of the Syrian rebel alliance is a generational turning point for the Middle East.
The end of this regime is a defeat for all who enabled its barbarity and its corruption. None more than Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia.
And Sudan is now the biggest humanitarian crisis ever.
The United Nations has said more than 30 million people are in need of aid, and 12 million have fled their homes.
Join us on The Voice of America as we explore the issues in the news.
I'm Scott Walterman in Washington.
And I'm Lori London. Thousands of Syrians gathered Friday in Damascus' historic main mosque for the first Muslim Friday prayers since the ouster of President Bashar Assad, while giant crowds celebrated in the capital's largest square.
Now, everything that has happened in Syria over the past week is going to have an impact on the wider Middle East. So let's broaden the conversation. Joining us from Cairo to help is Paul Salem, Vice President for International Engagement with the Middle East Institute. He's also the organization's former president and CEO.
First of all, what is your reaction to what has unfolded?
Well, first of all, obviously, the developments of the last 9-10 days have surprised and stunned, I think, everybody involved. The HTS group itself was only planning a limited offensive to take part of western Aleppo. They ended up basically toppling the entire regime in a few days, and the regime effectively melted away when tested. So everybody is quite surprised with what's happened. The person who has taken over as interim prime minister was the acting, or was sort of the minister or prime minister of the area of Idlib, which is an area in the northwest of the country where HTS and some other groups were. He's a technocrat, he's an engineer. He was brought in by the militant group to run that part of the country. He had been Minister of Development and Human Rights in that enclave as part of sort of an interim government that they had set up. So it's a positive step that somebody like him is in charge, at least for a few months. There is concern that HTS, the rebel group itself, which certainly is the main armed group that has led this last assault, but they've done it peacefully. They're talking about a transition. They're talking about forming a government.
Let's talk about the region itself. With Assad and that government gone, this has created a vacuum in the Middle East, a power vacuum. How does that affect everybody else?
The Assad regime had become fairly vacuous and weak. It had lost control of much of Syria. The area that it nominally controlled, it only controlled it by virtue of support from Russia and from Iran and Hezbollah and other groups, and it controlled very, very loosely. It had become a narco state. There's a lot of gangs going on. So, there's a bit of a vacuum, but not a major one. But what has happened is a major impact on the region, particularly that Iran certainly has lost its longtime ally and its presence in Syria, which goes all the way back to 1980, basically. So, 44 years. And Syria has been, for all of that period, Iran's only really Arab ally as a state. And Syria was the conduit through which Iran could arm and supply Hezbollah in Lebanon as well. So by losing the Assad regime, Iran loses a major ally, and it also loses its ability to support Hezbollah in Lebanon. So those are major blows to Iran. And I would say by far they are the biggest loser. Sure, Russia is a loser. Russia had entered Syria in 2015 to prevent regime change in Syria. And it really was a move to kind of block U.S. sort of global hegemony and what they perceived as a U.S. agenda of regime change in many different countries. So Russia has certainly lost an ally as well. And President Assad apparently is in Russia himself. I'm sure also President Putin is not happy that a popular uprising has unseated a dictator because he is a dictator of sorts in Russia, and he's very afraid of popular uprisings in Russia as well.
We'll get back to Russia in a minute, but I want to focus a little bit on what you were saying about Iran and Hezbollah. It has been a bad year for both, has it not? And this is not going to be a turn of their fortune.
Absolutely. The loss, the decapitation and the loss of most of Hezbollah's capacity was a real body blow to Iran. Hezbollah was their main deterrent force against any Israeli attack on Iran or any American attack on Iran. They've lost that. They could have, had they not lost Syria, they could have thought down the road of rearming Hezbollah and retraining them and building them up again over the years. So it's been a very bad few months for Iran, for sure, losing Hezbollah and now losing Syria. And you add on to that the fact that Israel took out most of their air defenses in their attacks a number of weeks ago. And Iran now lies extremely vulnerable to an Israel which is certainly on the warpath and an incoming Trump administration which is fairly aggressive as well.
Right, but it seems like also, wouldn't you say that an incoming Trump administration is friendlier when it comes to the Russia part of this?
Yes, certainly that is the case. President Trump is known to be fairly friendly to Russia, and that might translate into some arrangements between Russia and Ukraine. It might also translate into Russia being able to keep a naval base and an air base in northwestern Syria. That might be, the case. But the Trump administration is certainly very aggressive towards Iran, and Iran is the one that's feeling excessively vulnerable.
If the rebel groups follow through on what they've been saying, an inclusive government, not imposing heavy restrictions on women and such, what do you see for the future of Syria?
I think we can be fairly hopeful that this group, the HTS, will not impose radical extremist religious restrictions. They've been fairly moderate for at least 8-9 years now, so it's not exactly new. And they've been very vigilant over the last 10 days with the armed groups that they've sent into Aleppo and other places. And indeed, the treatment has been very positive to minority groups, to Christians, to others. It has not been sort of a radical Islamist takeover. And they have promised to be inclusive. The proof is the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. We'll see. But I think one can be hopeful. The risk is more that Syria is a fairly large country. There are different armed groups in different parts of the country. There's 3 or 4 foreign armies, the Turkish army, the Russians, the Americans. So it's a very complex situation and a very weak, fairly collapsed state. So it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of international support for this transition that's starting off fairly hopefully to succeed over the long term.
We're hearing a lot about people really upset and worried about their loved ones that may have been in these prisons, and including, there's a lot of talk about American journalist Austin Tice and if he's still alive and how to locate him. Is this a large task for all of these people to locate their loved ones, or is this something that could also be resolved quicker than we would imagine?
Well, as you say, I mean, the level of relief among most Syrians after not just years, but decades of one of the most brutal regimes on the planet. And we're seeing, part of the brutality with the opening of the prison. So the sense of relief is tremendous and profound. And as you indicated, and as I was saying, the takeover of these groups and the collapse of the state has happened very peacefully. The government, the prime minister welcomed the change, which is quite interesting, unusual. But in Libya, after Gaddafi fell, the first few weeks were lovely. It happened in some other countries as well. And then a few weeks or months down the road, different armed groups started going at it, and life took a turn for the worse. But for now, yes, it is. The mood is very hopeful. A lot of refugees are streaming back from countries back to Syria. I think that, once they're able to get to all of the prisons and the different levels, because there's still levels that they haven't gotten to in all the prisons. It's a very sad and macabre process. Those they find, many of them have been, tortured for years. But they will find those who are still alive fairly quickly. And then one must assume, I suppose, that those they don't find are no longer with us. How rigorous that process will be, how will they be able to account for everybody? That's certainly a big sort of administrative task. I certainly think the international community can also, send forensic experts and other types of agencies and experts that could help in that process. But it's a very, very traumatic, process to see what has been done over the past years.
You mentioned it in passing about the brutality of life in Syria over not just the 50 years of their rule, but the last 13 of the civil war. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands disappeared, hundreds of thousands killed in the fighting.
And so many or more are starving and in dire need of humanitarian aid.
Absolutely. You're describing a situation that has happened over the last 10, 13 years. It proved to be currently the most brutal regime of the 21st century, I would say. And that's why a lot of people are extremely glad that it's gone.
Paul, thank you so very much for the time.
All right, take care.
That was Paul Salem, Vice President for International Engagement with the Middle East Institute and formerly the organization's president and CEO.
You're listening to Issues in the News. I'm Scott Walterman with Lori London. Another big story this week has been widely overlooked.
Our calls for humanitarian access to conflict hotspots in Sudan have never been more critical.
Sudan has become the largest humanitarian crisis ever recorded, the largest displacement crisis in the world, and is heading toward one of the world's worst famines in decades.
The country's collapse is accelerating as a brutal civil war, fueled by outside powers, devastates the lives of civilians.
Far from working toward a diplomatic resolution, leaders of both factions seem to believe that continued fighting best serves their interests, putting Sudan on course for devastating humanitarian collapse in 2025.
Let's get a deeper look at this situation that really has been out of the world's focus. Joining us is Michelle Gavin. She's a senior fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Thanks for taking the time to speak with us about this. We heard this week from the International Rescue Committee that the humanitarian crisis in Sudan is the largest since records began.
This has been, it's both a frustrating conflict because in many ways it's senseless. Neither side has got the military capacity to win. It's frustrating because it's fueled by external powers who are not having to deal with the consequences of the human suffering. But it's also frustrating because it seems forever to be forgotten, even though it is in fact the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And it's a situation in which the armed conflict has been characterized by atrocities, but also by denial of humanitarian access on a massive scale. So people are starving to death.
Some people believe that the Sudan is at risk of breaking apart or becoming a failed state. Do you agree with that assessment?
I 100% agree that the risk of state failure is massive. The longer this goes on, the more fragmented Sudanese society becomes as different identity groups, different regional groups try to protect themselves. And so any peace negotiation then gets more complicated because you have a whole lot of different actors at the table. And you know, for a lot of Sudanese people, they would say their state has failed. There is no, for many Sudanese people right now, there is no authority looking out for their interests.
So the war erupted in April of 2023. Can you talk about why this happened? What led to this?
Sure. So Sudan was governed for a very long time by a pretty brutal authoritarian regime. And that regime had both its regular armed forces and a set of kind of paramilitary forces that it used to exert control and to keep each other off balance to some degree, right, to try to prevent a coup. Then in 2019, 2020, the Sudanese people rose up and demanded democratic governance. They wanted to oust that regime. And you had this fragile period of sort of civilian military transitional government that was supposed to be driving toward an all-civilian government selected by the people. But in that transitional period, the jockeying for power between the formal army and this paramilitary group, the RSF, eventually spilled over into outright conflict. So it's two elements of the former regime, the one that was decisively rejected by the Sudanese people fighting for control.
You also mentioned earlier there are external actors in this, among them Russia, who's selling arms and taking gold, and it is in their interest, they believe, to keep the war going, as it is with some of the other groups, including some Islamist groups inside Sudan, no?
No, that's absolutely right. There are hardline Islamists allied with the Sudanese armed forces. Russia has got relationships on both sides of this conflict. But there are other entities, the United Arab Emirates, supplying the RSF, which is a force perhaps best known for committing atrocities. And so there are a lot of different international actors pursuing interests that really, in many ways, have nothing to do with Sudan. Perhaps it's a proxy competition with someone else, or it's about aspirations eventually, in the case of Russia and the armed forces to eventually have some kind of presence on the Red Sea. But it's there has been an absence of accountability, both for those in Sudan committing atrocities, denying people humanitarian aid, and those outside who are fueling this conflict.
So circling back to the beginning of where we started, that this is considered the worst humanitarian crisis ever recorded. What you mentioned earlier that millions of people are at risk of starving to death. What else can you tell us about what is happening on the ground with civilians?
Millions have been displaced, so they remain within Sudan's borders, but they've had to flee their homes, and we're talking about 12 million people. There has been a tremendous amount of sexual violence. Healthcare facilities have been targeted in this war. So the deliberate destruction of hospitals and clinics. And as humanitarians will tell you, kind of a food security emergency is the sort of apex of humanitarian disaster. So you can pretty much bet when people are starving to death, you can pretty much bet they don't have access to basic sanitation. They don't have access to healthcare. It's that's the kind of last straw of basic human needs not being met. And that is where some, 30 million people are in need of assistance. A large chunk of those are in this emergency stage.
They really got blown out of the news when the Israeli-Hamas conflict started. Why do you think it is that we pay such little attention to Sudan?
I have been asking myself this question several times a day for quite a while now. I think part of it is that among the belligerents, there are no clear good guys, right? Both sides are unpopular with the Sudanese people, and both sides have committed atrocities. So that's perhaps part of it. I also think that there's a degree to which a fairly racist assumption that violence is some kind of natural state in parts of the African continent is responsible for at least a portion of the neglect. And Sudan's own history, of conflict and crisis can inform that and make people think, well, isn't Sudan always in turmoil? Which is such a shame, because Sudan was such an exciting story of people, very brave civilians, risking everything to try and take their country in a different direction. I don't totally understand why it's not getting more attention, because there certainly are consequences and spillover effects that will have a real impact on the interests of many, many societies, not just Sudan's neighbors.
Turkey says it wants to step in to try to resolve disputes between Sudan and the United Arab Emirates, as you mentioned. What needs to happen and to have this thing end?
Well, since neither side is strong enough to defeat the other, there should be a reasonable incentive to come to the table. So what needs to happen, I do think it's more accountability and exposure and risk for the entities that continue to fuel this conflict with weapons and with money. And then there needs to be a comprehensive discussion of what kind of security guarantees all parties here need to see to take their foot off the gas, as it were, in terms of fueling this conflict. So if some of these entities are providing these weapons because they believe that if they don't, an antagonist will gain some kind of important strategic advantage, then okay, let's figure out how to address that security concern. So there needs to be a really comprehensive dialogue to try and address core concerns.
The United Nations has tried to get them to the table and been unsuccessful. Do you think that that's even possible to bring the two to the table?
Yeah, I do think it's possible, but it requires a degree of focus and will and willingness to accept the costs and consequences.
All right. Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this and bring this to light.
Thank you so much for covering it. Thank you.
That was Michelle Gavin, Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And that's all the time we have this week. On behalf of all of us here at VOA in Washington and around the world, thank you so much for listening.
For more news throughout the week, you can listen to our podcast, The Issue, Monday through Friday. It's on our website. Just Google VOA The Issue, or go to wherever you get your podcasts from.
Join us next week for more issues in the news. Until then, I'm Lori London.
And I'm Scott Walterman.